Should you fight a war you're not sure you can win? And does the good a war can do ever outweigh the evil that necessarily accompanies it? These are the questions we're going to be looking at in the context of redistributive wars. I'm Dr. Blunt. Thanks for tuning in. The first condition that we're looking at in this video is called the reasonable chance of success condition. It means that you shouldn't fight a war if you're not sure that you can win it. And this makes a lot of sense, right? We know that war causes a whole bunch of bad stuff to happen, so don't fight unless you're sure you can win. But what does that mean? Reasonable chance of success. Greater than 50%? Greater than 70%? Greater than 80%? Well, if we're ratcheting up what is a reasonable chance, then some of the wars that have occurred in history, wars that seem intuitively just, might not meet this condition. Let's have a look at a little bit of history. Okay, so I'm excited because I get to talk about one of my favorite non-philosophy topics, and that is Byzantine history. Yay! Byzantine history addresses the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. And don't you dare say that Byzantine history is not Roman history. There is a clear line of continuity between Constantinople and Rome. Just because it's not in Rome doesn't mean it's of Rome, and I will cut you over this. I don't care if I'm wearing tie-dye. Okay, that was a bit dramatic, but the period of Byzantine history that we're looking at is 1453, the final siege of Constantinople. So at this point, the Roman Empire has shrunk down from, the entire Mediterranean basin to essentially Constantinople, what is now Istanbul, a few islands in the Aegean Sea, and the Morea, southern Greece, the Peloponnesus. It gets surrounded by the Ottoman Empire. It takes up pretty much all the territory that Rome used to occupy. And the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, the conqueror, he decides he's having Constantinople. He can't have a major city occupied by enemies in the middle of his territory. He besieges it, and he brings with him, at a minimum, about 80,000 professional soldiers and a huge number of irregulars. He also brings with him the most advanced artillery in the world at the time, and he offers the people of Constantinople a choice. You can surrender, in which case you will become part of the Ottoman Empire, but you'll still maintain some of your religious rights. You'll have to pay an extra tax. You're going to lose your major places of worship, but you'll be able to keep some. It is peace with some dignity attached to it. Now, the final Roman emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, decides to refuse this offer. Now, you might say, well, did he have a chance of winning? Here's how it stacked up. He had 8,000 people to man the Theodosian walls, the land walls. He was expecting some reinforcements from Western Europe, but not many, not reliably. And he was basically on his own. So why did Constantine XI Palaiologos, the emperor of the Romans, decide to fight? Well, he was outnumbered 10-1, but he did have the Theodosian walls between him and the Ottomans. Now, the Theodosian land walls, you can still see them if you go to Istanbul, are massive. They were built by Theodosius II, I think, about 1,000 years before 1453. They'd never been breached in history. When the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, it's because they managed to beat their way through the sea walls, not the land walls. There was a good chance that these walls were going to hold up again. After all, in recent memory, the Byzantines had managed to see off an Ottoman siege. Maybe they thought, well, if we hold out, they might get distracted by another event. Tamerlane showed up the last time they besieged Constantinople. Or perhaps reinforcements will arrive from the west. The Pope had promised reinforcements. Perhaps Venice would get its act together and send reinforcements to Constantinople as an apology for the Fourth Crusade. He might have thought, well, better to roll the dice than to face extinction. Because if we do surrender, that's the end. That's the end of the Roman Empire. And the people of the city supported him in this. There was widespread popular support for resisting the Ottomans one last time. Now, of course, it didn't really work out well for Constantine XI. The last time we see him in history, he is charging into a pack of Janissaries knowing that the city is lost and that the Roman Empire has gone extinct on his watch. They don't find his body, really. I think they find his headless corpse, and they identify it because he had the Roman imperial sandals on. But it was not a great move. Perhaps in the ensuing sack of the city, the people of Constantinople regretted their defiance. But that doesn't mean it wasn't a reasonable chance to roll the dice. So what's the point of this long and boring visit to Constantinople in 1453? Well, it's simply to say that the chance of success is contingent, right? It depends on the context of the war that we're looking at. There's no universal principle we can put into play. A lot will depend on the nature of the war, of the cost of failure, the nature of your enemy. So if you're looking at an extinction war, a war against an implacable enemy, perhaps a very low prospect of success is necessary. Think about Poland in World War II. Poland gets invaded by Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany is fighting an unprovoked war of aggression against the Poles, and then the Soviet Union comes in from the other side to carve out a bit of Poland for itself. This was not a war that Poland could win, but it seems wrong to say that Poland should have surrendered as a result. Just because you can't win, well, just because you don't have a great chance of winning doesn't mean you shouldn't fight. And that's not romanticism about a noble last stand. This is saying that sometimes the enemy, such as, a genocidal totalitarian regime on one hand, and a totalitarian regime bent on crushing individual autonomy and free enterprise, if you're into that sort of thing, on the other, these are enemies that are probably worth fighting even if your chances of survival are minimal. So I guess the question is, are states that are experiencing severe poverty and inequality in the position of, say, Constantinople in 1453 or Poland in 1939? Well, remember back in the first video, I said, you open your newspaper because you're an old boomer like me, and you see that India and a coalition of impoverished states have declared war on NATO for the redistribution of the world's resources. Now, you'd probably say, good luck to them. They're not going to win. NATO has a huge nuclear arsenal, the most advanced conventional weaponry in the world, the best trained soldiers in the world, and they're the world's wealthiest economies. They can maintain a war for a very long time. This doesn't seem like a war that these states could win, and you're probably right, but is that reason to not try? Is the ratio bad enough? It all depends, right? To me, I don't think it is. It seems like it would be an absolute fool's errand. But guess who is an affluent Westerner living in the lap of luxury amongst the decadent democracies of the global north? It's me, right? Now, the perspective from the global south might be a little bit different. Let's say you're a president of one of the precariat states I was talking about before. You might say, well, if I don't fight this war, millions of my people will die early deaths. They will live miserable lives characterized by hardship and disease. Why not fight a war? There's a difference between a slow death and a quick one. And perhaps we can gather enough forces not to defeat NATO, but to coerce them into redistributing wealth in ways that are more aligned with principles of cosmopolitan justice. That might be a chance worth taking if you are one of the presidents of these developing states that are fighting a war against NATO. States have fought against longer odds, perhaps. If they can deter the use of nuclear weapons, then maybe a massive imbalance of manpower would tilt the day in their favor. I still don't think so, but it might be a reasonable chance of success. Maybe. The final, thank God, condition of a redistributive war, for it to be just, is that it needs to be a proportional response to a wrong. Now, in just war theory, a state can only go to war when it is responding to an injustice that is deep enough to justify a war, and that it will produce benefits that outweigh the evil that it is experiencing. So if a state has a little border skirmish, this happens a lot between North and South Korea or between China and India, is that enough for a full-blown nuclear exchange? Most just war theorists will say no, that would be a disproportionate response. The evil that would occur, say, between an Indo-Chinese war would be absolutely outweigh the wrong of a border skirmish. This is sensible, right? You don't pursue a course of action, even if it produces good results, if the bad results that come with it swamp it, completely eclipse it. We need to be proportional in our responses and in our aims when we're talking about war. So, what's global poverty like? Is it like a border skirmish, or is it like tanks crossing the border in a full-blown aggressive invasion? Now, in the first video, I made the case that global poverty bears a huge resemblance to conventional aggression. So we might say, yeah, this is a pretty serious wrong. Now we have to ask, is it a wrong that being righted through war, that's not an elegant way of saying it, but let's continue, outweighs the evil that would accompany a redistributive war? And this is where there's a big debate to be had, right? So think about it this way. If the full force of NATO was poured against this alliance of southern states, the death roll could be in, the millions, perhaps even the hundreds of millions. Now, global poverty kills about 19 million people a year from avoidable deaths. Still, that's smaller. So perhaps we should say, well, you just have to suck it up, people living in states that are subjected to extreme inequality, because the alternative is simply too violent. It's too costly. It is disproportional. Well, it's a compelling argument, but it is also an argument for appeasement. Appeasement is an ugly term when we look at the ethics of war. It is often brought up in the context of the interwar period, the concessions given to Hitler's Germany that I talked about in the previous video, when I talked about, the reoccupation of the Saarland, the annexation of the Sudetenland, the Anschluss with Austria. These were all things designed to buy off an aggressive, revisionist Nazi Germany. Was it worth it? Well, it eventually led to war, so we might say no. But in the context of the 1930s, a lot of people were in favor of this approach, voted for this approach. The peace movement in Europe and North America in the interwar period was incredibly strong. People wanted to avoid war at almost any cost. So perhaps we can say, well, appeasement in that instance was wrong, but perhaps appeasement of an aggressor sometimes is the correct thing to do when there is a question of proportionality. This is a hard challenge, because I don't want to have this knee-jerk reaction that appeasement is universally bad, but it's a big ask, right? We're asking people who are living under conditions that I'm assuming that you are, like me, a decadent northerner, would never live in, right? I would never choose to live in severe poverty, and I would never tolerate living in severe poverty, I don't think. I would probably be pretty angry that there are people living lives of luxury on the back of an exploitative economic system. So why should we expect these people to appease us? Because they are appeasing us. We are the baddies in this circumstances. We are the people who are benefiting from an exploitative system of economic extraction. Well, I guess what we could say here, in order to really sort of put this intuition to bed, is that appeasing the global north would be an act of supererogation, right? An act that is morally good, perhaps, if it prevents an evil from occurring, but can't possibly be morally obligatory, because we cannot expect people to endure radical injustice as a matter of duty, right? That would just be an insane thing to request. Right? It'd be like telling slaves that they had no right to rebel against their masters because, slave rebellions don't have a great history of succeeding. Just because the chances of success and the proportionality question comes into play doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. And there's a really good way of thinking about this. In the ethics of war, we often use personalized analogies. Reduce the conflict between states to the conflict between persons. And Helen Frowe, who is an excellent philosopher when it comes to just war theory, gives the example of a woman who is faced with two alternatives: be murdered or be raped. These are not good things to choose, right? And they say, well, on the whole, perhaps it is better to choose to be raped than to be murdered. But this doesn't mean that rape isn't an extreme injustice. We might say that someone who decides to fight back against their would-be rapist, possible murderer, even if they're not sure that they can win, they are entitled to roll the dice. because it is a terrible injustice that they would have to endure in either case. And it's pretty rich for us to say that they are doing something wrong if they decide to fight back. And that might be the circumstances that people who are living in the global south are enduring today. We're asking them to choose between two equally unpalatable, well, not necessarily equally, two morally unpalatable choices. So when we get down to proportionality, we have to remember, when we think about proportionality in warfare, that asking someone to endure a radical injustice to prevent the perhaps slightly more radical injustice of war, this is a weird ask, because we're asking someone to endure the unendurable, something that we wouldn't endure. So I'm not sure that we can say that a redistributive war necessarily would be disproportionate because of the evils that would accompany it if there was a reasonable prospect of success. Okay, it's time to wrap up this video series on redistributive war. Where have we landed? So we've said that all of the conditions of just war theory can be met in a redistributive war. Now, that's not necessarily true in all instances of redistributive war, but it's at least a possibility. So do I endorse a redistributive war under current circumstances? The answer is no, and it's not just because I'm a tie-dye wearing hippie. The reason why I'm not willing to endorse a redistributive war in the year 2022 is because there are alternatives. And measure that with a small chance of success and the evils that accompany war, I say not quite yet, right? And what are the alternatives? Well, I've already talked about them in other videos. I've talked about illegal migration. I've talked about transnational social movements. These are peaceful ways of protesting against injustice. And if you look at the work of someone like Erica Chenoweth and Gene Sharp, you see that nonviolent resistance often has a higher success rate than violent resistance. So we might say, why would we choose war with all of the evils that accompany it, with the minimal chances of success, if there are peaceful alternatives available? You know, Gene Sharp says something quite astute. He says that when you take up arms, you're basically entering into conflict on the terms of the oppressor. The oppressor will always have more weapons than you. It is the nature of the system. And when we think about NATO versus the southern states, there is a huge imbalance of power there. So why would you choose to fight on a battlefield where you are necessarily going to be weaker? It doesn't make sense. I would also add that the redistributive war literature has a problem. It thinks about the world too simplistically. If we look at redistributive war theory, it often portrays the world as rich states versus poor states, good states versus bad states. The reality is much more complicated. If we look at, say, the people who are in charge of states in the global south, these are part of the global governing elite. They are often educated in Western universities. They go for shopping trips in London and New York. They have bank accounts in Switzerland. These are not freedom fighters necessarily. These are people who are integrated into the world system that they should be seeking to revise. So we can't really rely on them to be agents of justice. From a realistic perspective, it's just not going to fly. And that's why we get both realistic and ethical reasons not to engage in redistributive war, or to not expect them to be effective ways of revising the international system. So why have I been banging on about redistributive war for video after video after video? Well, by looking at all of these conditions, we reach a point where we say that violence is authorized. Even though we say there are alternatives available, we can see the case. And war is not the only form of political violence. Just because war is off the table doesn't mean other forms of armed struggle are necessarily off the table. Perhaps there's a case to be made for terrorism as a response to global inequality. Now that is a controversial topic, and it's going to be the topic of our next videos. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you like it. I hope you subscribe to the video series, share it around, and please add some comments into that box. I love hearing from you, and take care.